Well, hello to you from wherever you're joining us. Let's take a look at this document and do a complete document breakdown here. And we will provide some historical context for you, along with explaining each important concept or opinion that the cartoonist is trying to convey to the audience. And we'll probably do that by taking a look at other documents as well to kind of help us out. So let's just take a look at this document. We'll start here. Here you have a document in front of you. I'm not going to give you anything. However, just take a look at it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some observations here in our attempt to break it down, maybe use some skills that you may be used in while analyzing other documents throughout the school year. So let's just take our first look. All right, over here to the right, we have a African American. Over here to the left, we have a white gentleman here. And one of the things that we're probably going to notice right away is that, well, the white guy is on an escalator and he is smiling. Next, over here to your right, the African American has his hand over his face as if he is maybe a little stressed by what's in front of him. Now, if you have ever watched the Olympics, watch any track event, you can see right here, these are what you call obstacles or hurdles. All right. And what's going to happen here is that if you look, they're both going to the same place. So this is almost being set up as a race. Now, with this race, here's the finish line. They want to go to the finish line. And right here, the finish line is voting. So obviously, when we look here, if we're taking out words, okay, the one that should pop out at you is voting, hopefully. Also, these are going to start to pop out as you as well, the literacy test, the poll tax, and the grandfather clause. But we'll get back to that. So this is a race. This is what the African American has in front of him. The white guy is on the escalator, almost like if he's in a mall, very, very easily taking this journey to the top. He's even smiling. So they're going to go and vote. Now, he's not going to have a problem, but the African American is going to have the problem. If he wants to get there, he's going to have to get through a number of things: the literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and then we have these characters along the way, which we will get to. So let's try and break this down and see what it is. All right. Well, hopefully by now that you realize that this is from the Reconstruction era. So let's talk about what's going on during Reconstruction. Well, we can see that after the Civil War, African Americans who were considered slaves are now all of a sudden freedmen. So now what are going to be some things that you're going to do or put in place to make sure that, one, they are freedmen, and two, they are treated as citizens? So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, hopefully you're going to remember them as ABC. All right, so the 13th Amendment is first now going to abolish slavery. All right, this is going to now make Africans who were once slaves free. 14th Amendment is going to state that if you're born in the U.S., you are now a citizen. Now, if you're a citizen, you are going to have certain rights. And one of those rights is going to be to vote. So let's just go back to this cartoon for a moment, because that's what we're going to be addressing in this cartoon. All right, if you're a citizen, and apparently both of these guys here are citizens, you're going to have the right to vote. But we should see something here that is unfair. All right, the white gentleman over here on your left doesn't seem like he has anything in his way while he's on his way to vote. The African American does. So we're going to revisit that in a moment. So the 15th Amendment is going to give citizens the right to vote. It's going to forbid any state to deny any citizen the right to vote because of race, color, or creed. Now, when we look here, these are the amendments that we have in place that are to protect African Americans and give them rights. With that in mind, here you have this political cartoon right here staring at you. So why is it that one guy over here is going to have it easier than another one when it comes to voting? Well, let's break down what these obstacles now are. So if we look here, and we'll start with these obstacles, and we'll go from the first one to the end. All right, the first one here is going to require voters to read and explain a section of the Constitution. That's a literacy test. And when it came to that literacy test, that didn't always apply to reading and explaining the Constitution, which is something we will get to later on. That's just a textbook reference. But a lot of states, as we're going to see, use different tests to test somebody's literacy rate to see if they were able to vote. Why would that now be unfair? Well, this one, the African American who is now going to have to take this literacy test, chances are he just spent his entire life as a slave. Now, as a slave, you are someone's property. So if you're someone's property, they're not going to take the time to educate you. They're not going to take the time to teach you how to read. They're not going to teach you to take the time to teach you how to write. Now, are there instances where you did have slaves who did have the ability to read and write? Yes. However, those instances, there wasn't enough of them. So a large part of the African-American population after the Civil War, when it came to going to vote, probably would have a lot of difficulty passing a literacy test. So that's why this is going to be unfair. Now, all of these obstacles that are put in place, these are considered loopholes. That's one way of explaining it. Here, with the amendments, you have the rules. You have to follow these rules. Now, with this, these are put in place to kind of get around it. Okay, well, we're following the rules. This African American here can vote so long as he passes a literacy test. Another thing that they put in place was the poll tax. This is going to require voters to pay a fee each time they voted. Now, as a voter, as a citizen, when it comes to voting, it is your right. You should not have to pay each time you go to vote. However, this is being put in place to make it much more difficult for the African American to vote. So now, why are you going to require him to pay a fee each time he voted? Well, after the Civil War, they are now part of society. They are now citizens. However, they don't have a huge leg up on in life, so to speak. And let me just explain to you what I mean by that. You have a lot of these slaves who are now freedmen who now do not have an occupation where they're receiving a salary. They do not have homes. They do not have a savings account. They don't have a lot of money saved up. They don't have a lot of discretionary income, money that you'd be able to use at your discretion to spend on things that you could possibly enjoy. So requiring someone to pay a fee, no matter what the fee, that might be a little bit difficult when we're looking at African Americans trying to vote. Now, the grandfather clause, let's try and explain this with another document. When it came to the grandfather clause, if we look here, right, you had to pass a literacy test, and that's going to apply to everyone. And if you look in this cartoon right here, you have this white gentleman here who's writing on the side of the board here. He's trying to write something down. However, it is incomprehensible, incoherent, and it's spelled wrong. Now, what does that suggest then? That suggests that you had poor whites as well that did not know how to read. So that's something you see in this cartoon right here. These two gentlemen, and in the background, you see a sign, voters take literacy tests here. And right over here, you have them saying, by the way, what's that big word over there? So now what happened here is that since you did have a lot of poor whites who also weren't as educated and literate, they were unable to pass the test that was going to allow them to vote. So since this was going to be unfair to poor whites, what they did put in place was the grandfather clause. So now if a voter's father or grandfather had been eligible to vote on January 1st, 1867, the voter didn't have to take a literacy test. Again, another obstacle that an African American had to go through in order to vote. Now, when we look at these other ones here, when it comes to this literacy test, let me just explain that with another document. All right, if you look here, literacy tests were going to vary from state to state. Alabama focused heavily on civic procedure with questions like name the attorney general and other political officials. Georgia was more state-specific questions, asking what happens if the governor dies, who succeeds him. The hardest one out there in terms of literacy tests was the Louisiana literacy test that you're looking over here. These questions were really designed to stump the test taker. These were very, very difficult when we go through it, and it was designed to confuse people. So again, now you have a test, right? In the unlikely event, in certain states, you're probably going to be able to pass that literacy test. However, Louisiana is clearly trying to make it very difficult for people who are not literate, particularly African Americans, to pass that literacy test. And we addressed this poor white Southerner over here who didn't have the ability to read or write. And right here, we have here another document just helping to explain some of the obstacles that were in the way. This is actually a receipt from paying a poll tax. So this was one, and this was a rule that was on the books for a long time. So in 1955, this one particular gentleman here, Leo Carr, actually had to pay $1.50 to vote. And this was actually his receipt. So when we translate that into what that could possibly mean in terms of the value, $1.50 in 1955 would probably roughly be about $13 today, give or take, of course. Now, $13 even by today's standards doesn't seem like a lot of money. However, if you think about people who are not making as much money, maybe people who are working minimum wage, that can be really tough. This document did have evidence when it came to the analysis saying that, $1.50 during that particular time period for this gentleman, don't know what he did for a living, this was possibly a day's wages. So when we look at the poll tax itself, this was something that was going to be unfair. Later on, in 1966, this is going to be found to be unconstitutional. But again, that's one of those things that's going to take a lot of time. So we started off with this document. We didn't have a lot to go on at first, but we were able to break it down. We had these obstacles were designed to make it much more difficult for African Americans to vote, and that was because when we're looking at southern states who were trying to prevent African Americans from voting, this was a way for them to get around the rules. So you can always get this document available on our YouTube channel. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Man Cave Classroom, or on Instagram. We have daily lessons that come out along with historical context and a lot of other resources that you could possibly use to supplement your instruction.